I wasn't expecting much from today. Not anymore. It's not that I've lost faith, but somewhere along the way, I've learned to stop hoping for things that don't come. Still, there's a small flicker inside me that keeps me going. Maybe it's the stubborn part of me, the part that refuses to give up on something I used to believe in. Today is my 78th birthday. And for the first time in years, I found myself wishing it would be different. Part of me expected it. Part of me was waiting. But the other part, well, it had given up and I had accepted it. The years have worn me down in ways I didn't expect. When you've been alone for as long as I have, you get used to the silence. You get used to the empty chairs, the unanswered calls, the holidays without any guests. And yet, every time my son Jackson promises he'll come, I find myself believing it. I know better, but I believe it. So when Jackson called a few months ago, telling me he and his family would come for my birthday, I dared to feel something I hadn't in a long time, hope. He said they'd come, and I thought just for a second that maybe this time it would be real. Maybe this time they'd show up. I spent the morning preparing. Little things that used to matter. The smells of cooking, the sound of the clock ticking, the taste of memories lingering in the air. I laid out the old family recipes. Things Jackson used to love when he was young. A roast chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes, some of his favorite dishes. I even pulled out the old tablecloth, the one his grandmother had made for us, dusted off the fine china, the one we only used for holidays. I felt like a part of me, a part of what I had once known, was coming back together. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they moved with purpose, carefully. I put on the shoes he had bought me on my 50th birthday. I couldn't remember the last time I wore them, but today I needed to feel special, even if it was just for a little while. Noon I was ready. The table was set. The food was warm, and the house smelled like something from the past, like it used to when we were together. I even wore the red dress that I had always liked but never had the occasion to wear. It wasn't my favorite, but it was fitting. I couldn't stop myself from looking at the clock. The minutes seemed to drag, each one heavier than the last. The sun started to dip, and the clock told me that Jackson should be here by now. He had promised me he'd call before coming. But there was nothing. By 5 p.m. I was pacing. I checked the time again. I thought maybe I'd missed his call. Maybe I'd just been too eager, too excited. It's funny how you still try to hold on, even when you know the truth. I went to the old notebook where I wrote down important dates. Birthdays, anniversaries, anything that mattered. I flipped through it, looking at the past. Nothing out of the ordinary. But something inside me told me it was all too familiar. This had happened before. Every year, something would come up, and Jackson would cancel at the last minute. Then it came the call. I rushed to the phone, but when I answered, it wasn't Jackson's voice on the other end. It was a message. "Mama, I'm sorry, but we can't make it today. We're somewhere else. Things got busy. I'll see you soon, though." I didn't know how to react. I just stared at the phone. The message blinked back at me, cold and final. I sat down at the table, looking at the empty chairs. All the food I had made, all the effort I had put in, sat there untouched. And in that moment something inside me broke. Not because he didn't come, it wasn't the first time, but because I realized with a strange clarity that he wasn't coming back. Not really. I wasn't angry. I was just tired. Tired of waiting for something that would never happen. Tired of pretending that I mattered. And as the tears rolled down my face, I understood, maybe for the first time, that I was truly alone. After I finished the call with Jackson, a heavy weight settled on me, like a massive stone falling straight onto my chest. I couldn't bear those empty apologies and false promises of how next time things would be different. I thought to myself, never again. That thought became my strength. I wasn't going to wait for someone else to change. I needed to change. The hours that followed were spent not in sorrow, but with a quiet sense of clarity. I had made a decision, and the idea was becoming clearer by the minute. No more pretending. No more sacrificing myself for a family that saw me only as a means to an end. It was time for me to stop living in the shadow of my family, nurturing their relationships, offering my love, my money, my support, all without asking for anything in return. But no more. They no longer needed me, they only needed what I could give. And now I was taking it all back. I stood in the kitchen, staring at my plate of cold food, the meal I had prepared for my family. A meal that would remain untouched. For years I had made these meals, hoping they would come home, hoping for the family moments we used to share. But the truth was, those days were long gone. The effort, the love, it didn't matter anymore. And suddenly I understood that. It didn't matter if the table was set, if the food was perfect, if I had made everything just the way they liked it. They wouldn't come. They hadn't come, and they never would again. I reached for the phone, the decision already made. It was time to take the first step. I wasn't waiting for their calls anymore. I wasn't waiting for their promises, their broken assurances. I dialed the number I knew I had to call. James, my old friend. He had been a lawyer for years, and I had been thinking for some time now that it was time to make a change, particularly with Jackson's access to my finances. James, I need to close a few things. Can you help? My voice was steady, despite the storm brewing inside me. I had already made up my mind. No more pretending. No more being weak. James agreed to meet that evening, and I spent the hours before then sitting in my favorite armchair, sipping warm tea. As I sat, thoughts raced through my mind. What I was about to do, what I was about to change, felt monumental. It was as if I were shedding a skin I had worn for far too long. It was the first time in a long while I felt a real sense of power. The next few days were spent reviewing my bank accounts, searching through old agreements and contracts that Jackson might have used to manipulate me. With each button I pressed, each document I reviewed, I felt myself becoming something stronger, something I hadn't been for years, a woman who refused to be taken advantage of anymore. James never asked why I wanted to make these changes. He didn't question the sudden shift in my decisions, the strength I was suddenly showing. He simply said, "You have every right to decide how you want to spend your final years." His words stuck with me. I wasn't confused. I wasn't naive anymore. I knew exactly what I was doing. This wasn't just about money or control, it was about dignity. It was about my right to choose what I wanted for myself, and to stop being a tool for others to exploit. Jackson had underestimated me. They all had. And for the first time I was finally standing up. Not for anyone else but for me. That night, after my conversation with James, I sat in the quiet of my home, the phone sitting on the table beside me. My fingers hovered over it, debating what to do next. I had just taken control of my finances, but there was one more thing that needed to be done. One final piece of the puzzle. I picked up the phone and dialed Jackson's number again. This time there would be no more apologies, no more waiting. "Jackson," I said when he picked up. "I've taken the necessary steps. You no longer have access to my money or my accounts." I could almost hear him on the other end, stammering, not understanding, trying to find the right words. "You can't do that, Mom," he protested. "I can. And I have." My voice was calm, but inside a fire was burning. "I've spent enough years giving you everything I have, trying to make things work. But now I see what you really wanted from me. You didn't need me, you just needed what I could give you. And that ends today." I hung up the phone without waiting for his reply. A strange peace washed over me. The decision had been made, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold. Over the following weeks I took my life back piece by piece. I went to the bank, closed out old accounts, and began putting the pieces together to create a future for myself. It was slow at first, but it didn't matter. I was doing it on my own terms. I had been a mother, a giver, a caretaker for so long. But now I was learning how to be just me again. And for the first time it felt like freedom. A freedom I had never known before. The changes didn't stop with my bank accounts. I sold things I no longer needed, cleared out clutter that had built up over the years. I gave away furniture I had once bought with hopes of making a home for my family, and it felt like I was letting go of the past, like I was creating space for something new. There were moments of doubt, of course. Moments when I questioned if I was doing the right thing. But each time I remembered the feeling I had when I hung up the phone with Jackson, the sense of liberation that came with finally taking control. In those quiet moments when I sat alone in my living room, I felt a strength I hadn't known was possible. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And this time I was doing it for me. The day after I made my decision, I woke up early. The room was cold, and the sun was just beginning to light the contours of my old living room. I didn't rush to get up. Instead, I sat in bed, staring out of the window, listening as the world gradually woke up around me. My old phone sat on the table, and though I knew I should be making a call, I couldn't bring myself to press the button, to hear their voices again. Jackson had not been on my mind for days now. I had made up my mind. I was no longer going to live in the shadow of his illusions. I would not wait for him to decide when he would return, when I would again be part of his life. I didn't need his pity, and I didn't need his apologies. He had disappointed me more than I could ever express in words, but this time I would not let him manipulate me again. That day, I didn't allow myself to think about family or Jackson. I had a meeting with James, who was preparing the documents for me. I chose an old dress, the one I always felt confident in. It was from the days when my husband and I used to travel together. Back then I was younger and that dress had a different meaning. Now it held an entirely different weight. I wore it not for anyone else but for myself. When I met James, we sat down at a large wooden table, and he began to show me the papers I hadn't even suspected existed. I listened carefully as he explained the legal aspects of freezing my accounts and revoking Jackson's access to my property. Each word felt like a turn of a key in a lock. I was holding that key in my hands, and I couldn't believe that, at this moment, my son would no longer be able to control my life. Finally, James asked, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I looked at him and said, "I'm doing this for myself. I want to be free. I'm no longer going to be a burden to my children. They need to understand that I'm not their resource anymore." Each step, every document signed at that table, was proof that I was no longer going to allow my family to control my life. And though inside me there was still that aching feeling of sadness and hurt, I knew that this was necessary. Had to be done. Later that same day, I received another message from Jackson. "Mom, we've talked it through. Let's meet." I didn't respond. There was no need for further explanations. His time had passed. The weight of my decision was heavy, but it was a weight I had carried with me for too long, and now it was finally lifting. That evening, I returned to the quiet of my home. The house felt different, quieter in a way that made it seem like I was no longer pretending to be something I wasn't. My life was now my own. The weight of the years I had spent giving, sacrificing, and waiting had been replaced by a sense of finality that was freeing, even though it left me with a hollow sadness in my chest. I sat at my kitchen table later that night, my hands resting on the surface, the cold air creeping in from the window. I could still hear the echoes of the past, the laughter of my children, the days when this house had felt like a home. But now I could only hear the silence. It wasn't a silence of despair. It was a silence of strength, of peace. I looked around the room at the empty chairs, at the untouched plates, and I realized that I was finally free from the need to please, from the need to make everyone happy. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to give me a reason to feel important. I thought about the years I had spent chasing after love, after approval. The way I had kept quiet, allowed myself to be overlooked, to be used. I had done it out of love. But now that love had run out. It was no longer a love that nurtured. It was a love that depleted. And I wasn't going to let myself be depleted any longer. The next morning the house felt different again. It was a new day, and I woke up with a sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't feel lost anymore. I didn't feel like I was waiting for something I couldn't have. There was a certain calmness in the air now. The storm inside me had passed. I began making plans. Small things that mattered to me. I had spent so many years arranging my life around the needs of others. It felt strange at first to do something for myself, but as the days went on, it became easier. I started doing things I had once enjoyed, things I had forgotten about in the rush of trying to meet everyone else's expectations. I painted the kitchen wall a soft, calming shade of blue. I spent hours in the garden, pulling weeds and planting flowers that I had always wanted but had never gotten around to. I started to take back the parts of me that had been buried under years of neglect, under years of giving without receiving. And I began to understand that my worth wasn't tied to the service I provided for my family. It was tied to me, just me. As the weeks passed, I continued to move forward. I didn't hear from Jackson. Not that I expected to. His messages had always come with strings attached. His words had always been coated with the same empty promises. But now I knew the truth. I wasn't the one who had to change. They needed to. It was a strange thing to realize, that I had been waiting for a family that had never truly existed. The family I had built in my mind was full of love and understanding, full of warmth and connection. But that wasn't the reality. The reality was that my family had only needed me for what I could give them. And when I could no longer provide, I was forgotten. But no more. I was no longer just a giver. I was learning to be a receiver too. I was learning that my worth didn't come from the approval of others. It came from within me. And that, in itself, was more than enough. The day after James had finalized the documents, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, reflecting on the change. There was no regret. Just a calm, steady sense of empowerment. I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I was finally ready to let go, and in doing so, I was taking back my life. The phone remained silent. And for the first time in years, it felt like peace. The next morning, I woke up with a strange lightness in my chest, like I had just emerged from some heavy, oppressive sleep. It was as if the weight of years had been lifted without me realizing it. For so long, every day had felt like a burden, pulling me down further and further into a haze of helplessness. But now it was as if I had crossed some invisible threshold into something new. What was this? What was this feeling that had settled in my soul like the first rays of sunlight after a storm? The answer that had been lurking inside me for so long had finally arrived. I realized that there was no more room inside me for waiting. No more need to wait for something that might never come. No more need to wait for Jackson to change, for him to come back to me, for him to acknowledge me the way I had always hoped. It was time to let go of the expectations, the illusions I had clung to for so long. That chapter of my life was over, and now it was time to open a new one. Every day since my meeting with James felt like a fresh start. There was no more fear, no more despair in the mornings when I woke up. Every moment felt like a new opportunity, a new beginning. I had no idea that such freedom existed. Freedom from the expectations of others, freedom from the constant need to prove myself, freedom from the chains I had allowed to bind me for so many years. That very same day, I received yet another message from Jackson. It was the same old thing. He wanted to talk, to explain, to sort things out. There were important family matters that needed addressing. But this time I felt nothing. No anxiety, no fear, no anticipation. I didn't feel the pull to open the message and see what he had to say. It wasn't even a fleeting thought. I knew better now. His words meant nothing to me anymore. They were just empty promises, the same ones I had heard 1,000 times before. I didn't even bother opening the message. Instead, I did something that surprised me. I decided that this time I wouldn't answer him with words. There would be no more kitchen conversations, no more empty promises about future meetings. This time my response would be different. My response would be in my actions. Jackson had always believed that his words could sway me, that his apologies and excuses could bind me to him. But this time I wasn't giving him that power. The answer to his message, to his attempts to drag me back into the same old cycle, was simple. I no longer depended on his decisions. I no longer needed his validation. I didn't need his approval, his forgiveness, or his attention. I had spent years trying to be everything to him, trying to make him see me as someone worthy of his love, but now I knew better. It was time for him to understand that I was not some pawn in his game. I sat that evening in the same chair where, just a few days before, I had felt crushed by the weight of my own despair. But now everything had changed. The air felt lighter, the atmosphere in the room warmer. I held a cup of tea in my hands, feeling the warmth seep into me as I gazed at the evening sky. The stars were faintly beginning to appear, one by one, and I could feel their silent encouragement, their unspoken promise that everything would be all right. This was my moment. I had made the decision to free myself, and there was no going back, no more waiting, no more hoping for a change that would never come. I had made the choice to live for myself, to stop living in the past, in the shadows of others' decisions. The decision to move forward wasn't just about closing doors on Jackson or my family. It was about opening a door for myself. The pain I had once felt had been replaced with a kind of quiet determination. I no longer looked back at the memories with regret or sorrow. Instead, I looked ahead, knowing that the future was mine to shape. It was time to start living the life I had always deserved. A life where I was the center, where I made the rules, where I decided what mattered and what didn't. And so, I didn't respond to Jackson's message. I didn't need to. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need his approval. The decision had already been made. As the days went on, I felt a sense of calm that I had never known before. The house, once filled with memories of family gatherings, seemed quieter, but not in a lonely way. It felt peaceful now, as though the silence was my companion rather than an emptiness I was trying to fill. The days that had once felt heavy with disappointment and sadness now felt full of promise. I woke up each morning with a sense of purpose, ready to take on the day without the weight of old expectations. I took the time to rediscover things I had forgotten. Little things like reading a book I hadn't touched in years, taking long walks through the garden, or even just sitting quietly with my thoughts. For so long I had been living for others, trying to make everyone around me happy, but now I was learning to live for myself. And it felt like freedom. I found myself laughing again, enjoying simple pleasures that had once been drowned out by the noise of my family's demands. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in so long. Words that had once been buried deep inside me began to flow freely onto the page. It wasn't just about the words, it was about expressing myself, about finally giving myself permission to be heard. I began to reconnect with parts of me that I had long buried. The parts of me that loved music, the parts that loved to travel, the parts that were just me, without anyone else's expectations or demands. And as I did, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't just a change in my life, it was a transformation in who I was. I was no longer the woman who lived to serve others, to give until there was nothing left. I was a woman reclaiming her power, her peace, and her life. When I thought about Jackson now, it wasn't with the same desperation or longing. I didn't need his love, his attention, his approval. What I needed was me. And I had finally found her again. The future stretched out before me, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like a path I could walk with confidence. I had let go of the past, let go of the family that only saw me as a tool for their own needs. It was time to build a new future, one that was mine and mine alone. And as the days passed, I felt a sense of peace settle in my soul. I didn't need anything from them anymore. The only thing I needed now was to live fully for myself. And that was a freedom that could never be taken away. A few days after I made the changes to my finances, I felt like a different person. It wasn't just about changing accounts or updating documents. No, this was a complete rethinking of how I was meant to exist in my own life. To feel my own power, it was something entirely new. And this time I wasn't going to back down. I began waking up early, no longer weighed down by the exhaustion that had once clung to my legs and back. The fatigue that had become a permanent part of me seemed to disappear overnight. Most of my friends didn't notice the shift in my mood, but I could feel it. Everything was falling into place. Each day felt like an opportunity to see life in a new light. I decided to do more than just rewrite the documents or block the accounts. I began going through old boxes of photographs and letters. All those little things that had long been forgotten now looked like tiny doors to another world. I opened one box filled with photos, and there they were. Our moments with Jackson from childhood, his first steps, our family holidays. But now, when I looked at those pictures, I didn't feel sadness. I felt liberation. My house, too, became an important part of this process. I decided to refresh everything, starting with the furniture, down to the small details that had long been left untouched. I bought a new set of beautiful porcelain cups and placed them on the kitchen table. I put fresh flowers in a vase. The old walls of my home seemed to change along with me. But all of this wasn't just about aesthetics. It was for me. I no longer wanted to live in a house where every corner reminded me of what I had lost. This was my space, and I decided to make it exactly the way I wanted it. Now, it no longer reminded me of how I used to wait, how Jackson would come and time after time forget about me. The next morning, after I had made all the changes around me, I felt like I had won a battle with myself. With the changes in my home came a change in me. I no longer allowed anyone else to write my story. It wasn't just the home that had changed, it was me. I had spent so many years putting my heart and soul into other people's lives, into making everyone else feel secure and loved. But now I was focusing on my own needs, on my own desires. I could feel myself growing, expanding, becoming something I hadn't known I could be. I took long walks around the neighborhood, appreciating the little things I had never paid attention to before. The way the morning sun filtered through the leaves, the sound of birds calling to each other, the freshness in the air. It all felt so new, like I was experiencing life for the first time. I also took time for myself, really for myself. No longer did I spend my days trying to please others or meet their expectations. I allowed myself to be selfish in the healthiest way. I made my favorite meals, ones I hadn't cooked in years. I spent hours curled up with a book I had been meaning to read but had always put off. I even danced in the living room, just for the joy of it, feeling the music fill me with energy I didn't know I had. This new life wasn't about doing more. It was about doing less for others and more for myself. For once, the world didn't revolve around Jackson's whims or anyone else's needs. It revolved around me. I had earned this freedom. As I worked to create this new space for myself, I started thinking about the future. What would life be like if I continued down this path? What could I accomplish if I stopped holding myself back? I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I felt excited by the uncertainty. I imagined a future where I could pursue my dreams, my passions, things I had put off for too long because of others. I dreamed of traveling, of visiting the places I had only read about in books. I dreamed of learning new skills, perhaps taking a painting class or learning to play an instrument. I had spent so many years thinking that these things were frivolous, that there was no time for them. But now, time was all I had, and I intended to use it wisely. By the end of the week, everything felt different. My home was brighter, more alive, just as I felt. I no longer waited for Jackson to call or for anyone else to dictate how my life should be. I knew now that I could stand on my own, that I didn't need anyone's validation to live my truth. I looked at the photographs again, those moments with Jackson, and instead of feeling sadness or regret, I felt gratitude for the memories. They were a part of my story, but they no longer defined me. The phone rang one evening, and I glanced at it. It was Jackson again, his name flashing across the screen. This time I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel the usual pull to answer. Instead, I silenced the phone and placed it face down on the table. That was the moment I realized I was no longer bound to him. This time, it wasn't about cutting ties or making a dramatic gesture. It was about a quiet, subtle shift. One where I finally accepted that my life was my own. I had spent so many years living for others, waiting for them to come around, to love me the way I wanted. But now, I was learning to love myself in ways I had never allowed myself before. And it felt like freedom. A freedom I had earned. That day, I hadn't planned anything special. I sat in my old armchair, the one that had once been the place for long conversations with Jackson, but now it had become my corner for reflection. Everything felt calm, and for a brief moment, I thought I had come to terms with him, that everything had settled. But everything changed when I saw him, Jackson. He was standing in the doorway, tense and slightly nervous, just like always when he needed something from me. His expression was such that I didn't even know how to feel. At first, I thought it was just another visit, the kind where he checks in to see how I'm doing. But there was something in his face that suggested this time would be different. "Mama, I need your help. I'm sorry I haven't been around." You know how it is, but now I've got big problems and I don't know where else to turn, he said, trying to sound casual, as if his words didn't carry much weight. But I could hear the tension in his voice. Normally I would have said yes, I would have helped him because that's what I always did. I always put them first, even when it was hard for me. But this time I couldn't. I looked at him and felt all my previous efforts disappear in an instant. I wasn't willing to close my eyes to what he had done to my feelings anymore. I was no longer his bank or his transporter. I once again felt important, not just as a mother but as a person. You know, Jackson, I don't have anything left to give you, I said calmly, but with a firmness I hadn't expected from myself. He went silent for a moment, trying to process my words, and I saw his face start to shift. How can you say that? Mom, we're family. You can't leave us without help. His words were the usual set of accusations I'd heard 100 times before. But this time I was ready. Family. Yes, that's true. But family shouldn't just be a tool to exploit others. I've tolerated this for a long time, and now it's no longer the case, I answered, emotionless, but with a resolve that seemed to fill the entire room. The silence stretched out, and I could see his lips trembling. This was the moment I had prayed for so many years, hoping that he would understand. But I could no longer hold back. I wasn't going to live for him or anyone else anymore. I was ready to be my own priority. He looked at me, and I knew I couldn't change him. I didn't try to. Instead, I simply walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The decision was made, and this moment was the reflection of the new me in the mirror. I wasn't going to stay in the shadows anymore, the shadows that others had cast me into. Now I was myself, and no one would take that away from me. Every step I took in the last few days felt heavy, but it wasn't fatigue. It was freedom. I felt like I hadn't just broken free. I had found my own way. After everything that had happened, I no longer needed anyone's permission to live the life I wanted. There were no more empty promises or false hopes. The next morning when I woke up, I knew it was time for goodbyes. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my tea, reflecting on everything I had done and why it was necessary. I wasn't the woman anymore who could be easily deceived. I couldn't be manipulated anymore. This wasn't a feeling of revenge. It was simply a necessity. Then Jackson came again. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, just like always, filled with requests and demands. But I no longer saw them as something important. Mama, we're family. I understand everything, but I need your help. I don't know what to do again. You've always been there for me, he said. His words exactly as they always were. He was hoping once again that I would give him another chance. But now I knew that wasn't my responsibility anymore. I stood up, slowly placed my cup on the table, and looked at him. There was no anger. There was no pain. Just calm. This was the last time I would allow him into my space. You're right, Jackson, we are family. But family isn't about using each other. It's not about giving only when it's convenient. I can't tolerate this anymore. You've long stopped seeing me. But I won't look away any longer, I said without raising my voice, but with deep conviction. He stood there, mouth agape, not knowing what to say. He tried to argue, but I didn't give him the chance. I had already decided that he had no place in my life anymore. There will be no more help, no more apologies. It's over, I said, and his face flushed with anger and surprise. Felt no regret. I had had enough. I was no longer his victim. Instead of words, I simply took my things, retrieved what I had kept hidden for such occasions, and stepped out onto the balcony. I stood there for a moment, looking at the garden, where once we had all planted flowers together. Now it was my garden, the garden of my freedom. I didn't turn around when he left. I knew this was the real goodbye. And it was the right one. All those years I had given, and now it was my time. Time for myself. And this was only the beginning of a new life. I was alone but no longer lonely.